Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for you all for being here. And I hope that what I have to say in this brief time could be helpful for you. I will not address, because I know that others will do that, specific examples of educative or educational programs. I will, since I am the first one here in this phase of the meeting to intervene, I will mostly remember some data on the situation which we are facing now and the challenges for the future in what regards especially educational dimensions of museums. So I will try to share my, I don't know if you are already viewing my presentation.
Yes, yes,
okay.
We can see it.
So my title is somehow provocative, because of course I have in mind Huxley's work on the Brave New World. And maybe we are facing now a brave new time with all which this expression encompasses of good and possible also bad or framing perspectives for the future. And I will try to expose you some ideas on how I see today, how museums are today facing the situation, and how could they come out from this pandemic phase. You know that ICOM has organized also the most important worldwide survey on the situation of museums during the pandemic crisis. The first report has been launched in May, last May, has been adopted also by UNESCO as the report on museums around the world in face of the COVID-19. And some data is important to have in mind. Museums at that moment, May, the first wave of the pandemic crisis, had closed almost all around the world, 19%. And maybe 10% at that moment estimated never reopen again. This number is much higher. It attains some 25 to 30% in the United States, in places where museums are mainly private enterprises. And of course, these numbers, these figures are much lower than 10% in countries where museums are mostly public. But the average is 10%. Then also the idea of having the digital as the way to overpass the pandemic crisis, and maybe for some, not for me, I must say, the avenue for future in museums. Regardless what we could or can think about, because we are inside the digital bubble, we, intellectuals, urban people, the digital divides a lot. Only 5% museums in Africa have been able to provide online contents during the pandemic crisis. So the digital is a very problematic issue, not only as from the conceptual point of view, if that is really the core business of museums, but also from the democratic point of view. Don't mislead ourselves. Even in our country, in Europe, for instance, rich countries have 3 times more access to digital than poor countries. And inside each country, the division is amazing. And because it doesn't follow the more fancy agendas, like gender, or sexual orientation, and so on, in that regards, digital is neutral. Either men and women, either people with different races, and inside each community, I mean, they access in the same way to digital or to internet, but the traditional divisions of society, based on education level, age, social class, father's ancestry, and so on, those are very, very, very heavy as dividing causes, dividing the factors in the access to digital. Then finally, besides all of this, we have to be optimistic, because since 2011 up to now, 16 more museums have been created in the world. We have now about 95,000 museums in the world. Museums are booming, which is also for me, very good, and we have to have in count. I will not address the report, the ICOM UNESCO report, because it is online. You can access it and see it and study it as you may wish. But you see, when asked for foreseen economic impact, a lot of responders said that reducing of programs and was the fear. At that moment in May, I must say, closing museums was not yet a problem, a substantial problem. The situation is different now. Today morning, just today morning, it has been launched the follow-up report of the first survey. The second one done by ICOM in October, last October, before the second wave in Europe. And the situation is very much different from May. Now, people is much less optimistic than in May. Not so much in the domain of closing museums, in Europe, I mean. I have here only here the regional graphic chart for Europe. It would be different in Africa, of course. But let's see on Europe from the data provided today morning. Closing museums is not yet in Europe a very, very, very dramatic foreseeing perspective, but reducing problems, reducing exhibitions, suspend freelance and temporary contracts, that is a problem already. Significant. You see almost half of the responders, 1,900 did the answer. Almost half are afraid of suspending temporary contracts in museums. So we are much more concerned with future now than in May. I will pass rapidly because the regional difference is very important. In Europe, for instance, the most significant impact of the pandemic crisis in museums was the wider use of social media. In the United States of America, it was different. In Africa, also different. So there are regional, and please go to the surveys, the both of them, the May one and the November one, and also this one from NEMO, the Association of, the Federation of Associations of Museums in Europe. Also with very interesting data, not so strong, well supported as the one from ICOM, but still interesting data on, for instance, hashtags has increased dramatically, is what has increased more during the first wave of the pandemic crisis in European museums. Feature individual objects, and another important increasing, and so on. NEMO concludes that these four were the most important tendencies of museums during the pandemic crisis, or answers in a sense. Unique campaigns and series of on social media, engage in real time with live streamings, virtual tours, and virtual and artificial reality. So we are experiencing a world, we are living in a world where social media and internet in general was already before, but is much more now the channel to link, to unify or to put in contact all of us. But this has originated, it was already moving on, has originated much more now a different world, a world where people call others friends only because they are connected by Facebook. A world where people want to have a lot of likes and orient their behaviors accordingly. This is a world where activism, a new kind of activism is born or has already born, the keyboard activism. The social media activism with so-called power of the hashtag. But please note that the metaphor used even here is the real one. People in streets, not behind the keyboard. So there is a kind of disconnection between the new activism and the metaphor we have still in mind, the street one. People, really people acting in real life. And of course, the 2020 World Press Cartoon has a lot of cartoons on this, exposing us the brave new world which we are creating, of the selfies, the brave new world where maybe in the future only robots will be humans. Well, of course, it is ironic. But you see, in late 19th century, early 20s, when our time was foreseen, it was like this, the process of learning in school was foreseen as something very automatic, where people just, students, just listen with headphones in, like we do nowadays, I must say. It's not the same, we didn't evolve up to here, but we are not very far away from that, especially these last months. Well, museums will be different in the future after this pandemic crisis. Well, I'm not sure. They will, of course, be different because they are always moving and modifying. But they will not maybe different in the sense that we expect now when we are immersed in this digital bubble. For instance, in a recent newspaper article, I gave my idea on the new normal in museums, using something very easy to use. The tendencies, the trends of research in the Google platform, in the Google engine of research. And you see, it is in Portuguese, I'm sorry, but you see that the search for virtual museum has a peak, an immense and fantastic peak around March, April, last March, April, but then, and now it fall down to a very, almost insignificant, comparing to others, research tendencies. And the one which has growth is museum near me. This phrase, museum near me, or this component, which points to a traditional relationship with museums, as during the first pandemic wave collapsed, but then nowadays, and I have already the graphics up to October, and we can, as is increasing. I'm sure that now with the second wave, it will decrease again. But this is a glimpse on what we may face in the future, the return back to the museum in reality, not the digital dimension. Here I have it already, up to 28 October. And you see is the return to the research, the search in Google on the expression museum near me, augmented, not to a level which as the same level as it was before the pandemic crisis, but slowly it reaches that level. And the virtual visit, field visit, or the virtual museum decreased immensely, dramatically in recent time. So this is also the title of another paper, a more scientific paper, which I wrote about 1 year ago, before the pandemic crisis. And for me, the question is, museum with digital? Of course. of course, the most possible. But digital museums is another thing. In fact, being radical, I would argue that digital museums doesn't exist. They are not museums. They are archives. They are collections of images, including objects from museums' collections, but they are not really museums. If they are not anchored in real objects, in real collections, the use of the term museum, in my view, in this context, is an abuse. And of course, we know in each country, for instance, in Portugal, there are about 1,200 things calling themselves museums. But only 300 are certified as museums. And maybe, very optimistically, the double 600 are really museums, even if not certified. So there is an abuse of the term museum everywhere. In Spain, in Madrid, there is the El Museo del Jamón, which is basically a shop to eat ham. And in Portugal, the beer, and in Germany, and so on and so on. This is the definition, and I ask you to say me when I have only a few minutes to finish. This is the current definition, I'm sorry to be in Portuguese, definition of museum by ICOM. And you see, a museum is a heavy institution. It has a nature, no profit, permanent institution at the service of society and its development, and open to public. It has a function: acquire, preserve, research, communicate, educate, and exhibiting. A finality: education, study, and enjoy, and a scope: material and immaterial, heritage, and environment. I would argue myself, I'm arguing myself inside ICOM to add another dimension here, the community empowerment. But keeping the basis like it is up to now. A museum is a very nice institution. I'm working in museums, so let me say that. Is the most complete one as I see it. Much more complete than thematic parks, interpretive centers, commercial galleries, spectacles, performances, even school. School is the second institution much closer to museums in completeness. But museums, for instance, they collect real objects, and school is not so. Besides the school museum, that's why we are here, is not so centered in that as museums. And exhibition also. Museums are by nature places where things are exhibited. In school, not so much. So, but in general, is the most complete institution in this sense. So to finish, I will finish with my conception of what museums are in fact. And will tend to be much more in the future. I have developed this model of the three-pillar conception. Museums are like a bridge, a treble bridge, using the Simon Garfunkel paradigm, old song. A bridge which allows us to connect between people and things. People cycling, people here, and things, cars here. In doing so, this bridge is only possible to stand if it is based on three pillars. The first one is the research pillar. The research pillar is the one allowing for objects to enter museums. In my mind, and I have a different conception of maybe most of my colleagues in ICOM, the first function of museums is research. Research is the only fundament allowing to convert common objects in museums' collections. is only rationality lying behind the collecting of museums, of objects into museums, inside museums. So research for me is the first pillar allowing to connect museums with things. Then the second, the central pillar, without it, the whole bridge would collapse, is curatorship. For many of my colleagues, I'm not a curator, I'm an archaeologist. But for many of my colleagues, not only curators, of course, curatorship is really the central issue in museums. And I agree that without curatorship, the bridge called museum would collapse. But then there is a third pillar, the educational one, or disseminating one, if you want to be more encompassing. Without this pillar, museums would be vain. Museums would not also be museums. Museums only have a sense to exist if they allow to serve people, to connect with people. And this is, in a broad sense, education. I'm not addressing only educational, formal education, I mean, in schools, education in general, non-formal, informal education. So the disseminating purpose must be included in the life of museums at all levels. It is a common mistake, which I myself, when I was director of a national museum, committed, to consider the educational services in a museum as the last step when preparing an exhibition, for instance. It is an error. From the very beginning, when to consider a team, when to consider an ensemble of objects to address a question, the educational department has to be present in the team of the museum. This idea of museums as educational devices will maybe be, I'm not sure about, nobody can be sure about the future, but will maybe be one of the most important, if not the central dimension of museums in the future. In a very recent, last week, research paper published by 3 colleagues, French colleagues of us, one of them very known, Jean-Michel Tobelem, on French museums in 2030, how will they be? They, after a survey among experts, they conclude that 3 scenarios could be raised for the future. And the first one is deepening the educational and social dimension of museums. There are others, managerial and development perspectives and reinvention of museum itself, as an whole, I mean. But it is true that the dimension, the educational and social dimension of museums will be maybe more than today central in the future. We saw that, for instance, last week. In our, I'm addressing you from the museum, Archaeological Museum of Carmo, which is owned by the Portuguese Association of Archaeologists, from which I am vice president. And in our last conference, national conference last week, for the first time, since mid-20th century, we had an autonomous section on didactics of archaeology. And it was a surprise, but because a lot of colleagues registered and different experiences have been presented, observing international or national educative experiences in archaeology, in museums and in archaeological sites, of course, also. And these are some of them. Hands-on activities, specific age levels activities, strong communicational and educational components, especially in thematic parks. So I will end with this slide, which is known from most of you, I'm sure. Edutainment, education and entertainment are maybe the key issue for the future. In museums, maybe not only in museums, but in museums to begin with. The only remark, the only note is that edutainment without research and without curatorship doesn't fulfill completely the concept of museum and our mission in museums. Either national, community museums, school museums, associative museums, whatever. A museum, any museum, has to do edutainment, but based on research, on collections and curatorship of memories. And that's it. That's my intervention. Hope to have not been too long.
No, not at all. On the contrary, it has been really interesting. Thank you, Luis, for
okay, thank you very much.